In the pre-dawn darkness of September 15, 1944, Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller stood on the deck of his transport ship, watching the naval bombardment of Peleliu through binoculars. The legendary Marine officer, already bearing 3 Navy crosses from earlier campaigns, felt a gnawing unease as he observed the small coral island being pummeled by American shells. When a confident Navy captain casually asked if Puller would return for supper that evening, the colonel's response was sharp and prophetic. "If you think it's that easy, why don't you come on the beach at 5 o'clock, have supper with me, and pick up a few souvenirs?" Puller's instincts were tragically correct. The Battle of Peleliu would become one of the bloodiest and most controversial operations in the Pacific War, a battle that military historians would later argue should never have been fought at all. By the summer of 1944, the tide of World War II in the Pacific had turned decisively in favor of the United States. American forces had already secured the Marshall Islands by February, and the Mariana Islands campaign had concluded in August with the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These victories brought American B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The question facing Allied commanders was no longer whether Japan could be defeated, but how to achieve that victory most efficiently. 2 competing strategies emerged. General Douglas MacArthur advocated for the liberation of the Philippines, where he had famously promised, "I shall return," after his evacuation in 1942. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz favored a more direct approach, bypassing the Philippines entirely and seizing Taiwan and Okinawa as staging areas for the eventual invasion of Japan. In July 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt traveled to Pearl Harbor to meet with both commanders and hear their arguments. The decision reached was a compromise. MacArthur would get his Philippines campaign, but first, the Palau Islands, including the small island of Peleliu, would be secured to protect his right flank. The strategic rationale seemed sound at the time. Peleliu was a tiny coral island shaped like a lobster's claw, measuring just 6 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest point. But it possessed an airfield that could theoretically threaten MacArthur's operations in the Philippines, located some 500 miles to the west. Securing this airfield ensured that Japanese aircraft couldn't harass supply lines or troop movements. However, just days before the scheduled assault, Admiral William Halsey made a startling recommendation. His carrier task forces had conducted strikes against the Philippines and discovered the Japanese defenses were far weaker than anticipated. Halsey urgently suggested to Admiral Nimitz that the Peleliu operation be cancelled entirely and that MacArthur's invasion of Leyte Gulf be moved up to October. Nimitz agreed to accelerate the Philippines campaign, but decided it was too late to call off the Peleliu invasion. The 1st Marine Division was already at sea, steaming toward their objective. This decision would haunt the survivors for decades. As one historian later observed, Peleliu was a battle fought for an airfield that was never needed to support an operation that had already been accelerated. The Japanese garrison on Peleliu could have been, in the strategic parlance of the time, left to wither on the vine, isolated, bypassed, and rendered irrelevant by the advancing American tide. Instead, thousands of young Americans would pay with their lives or their bodies for a piece of coral that would contribute nothing to the ultimate victory. While American planners debated strategy at the highest levels, the Japanese were making revolutionary changes to their defensive doctrine. After suffering devastating defeats at Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan, where traditional tactics of defending at the waterline and launching suicidal banzai charges had led to the near-total annihilation of garrison forces, the Imperial Japanese Army realized a fundamental change was necessary. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Division, was given responsibility for Peleliu in May 1944. The 14th Division was considered one of Japan's elite units, recently transferred from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Nakagawa brought approximately 6,500 troops from his regiment, supplemented by about 4,000 naval personnel and a large contingent of Korean and Japanese laborers. In total, some 10,900 military personnel occupied Peleliu when the Americans arrived. But numbers alone would not determine the battle's outcome. Nakagawa had received new defensive directives from Imperial General Headquarters, based on lessons learned from recent defeats. The old tactics, meeting the invaders at the beach, launching mass banzai charges to overwhelm American positions, were formally abandoned. Instead, Nakagawa was ordered to implement a defense-in-depth strategy designed to inflict maximum casualties and delay the American advance for as long as possible. Nakagawa studied Peleliu's terrain with the eyes of a defensive genius. The island's most prominent feature was the Unbreakable mountain, a 300-foot-high massif of twisted, razor-sharp coral and limestone that dominated the northern portion of the island. Unlike typical mountains with soil and vegetation, the Unbreakable was a geological nightmare, a chaotic jumble of coral ridges, steep cliffs, narrow valleys, and deep crevices that would make conventional military operations nearly impossible. Most importantly, the Unbreakable contained approximately 500 natural and man-made caves, many of them former phosphate mine shafts operated by the South Seas Development Company before the war. Japanese engineers spent months transforming these caves into an elaborate defensive fortress. They carved out additional chambers, connected caves with tunnels, installed sliding armored steel doors with multiple firing ports, and angled entrances to protect against grenades and flamethrower attacks. Heavy artillery pieces, including 75mm guns and 47mm anti-tank weapons, were carefully positioned in caves with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun nests were established in coral outcroppings. The entire system was designed so that the destruction of one position would not compromise the others, a true honeycomb defense. Nakagawa placed only token forces on the beaches, enough to inflict casualties, but not enough to be obliterated by the inevitable naval bombardment. The real fight would come inland, where the Americans would be forced into a grinding war of attrition, clearing caves one by one, taking casualties with every yard gained. The goal was no longer to throw the enemy back into the sea, but to kill as many Americans as possible and delay their advance for weeks or months. If the tactic succeeded at Peleliu, it would become the model for defending Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Americans, meanwhile, made critical planning errors. Pre-invasion aerial photographs taken through dense jungle canopy failed to reveal the true nature of the Unbreakable. Intelligence reports described Peleliu's central terrain as low rolling hills, a catastrophic mischaracterization. The actual landscape was more like a fortress designed by a madman, with corals so sharp it could slice through boot leather, ridges so steep they were nearly vertical, and defensive positions so cunningly concealed that Marines would walk past them without knowing they were 10 feet from death. The naval bombardment, a false sense of security. On September 12, 1944, the pre-invasion bombardment of Peleliu began. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers pounded the small island with thousands of rounds of heavy-caliber ammunition. The battleships Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Idaho, veterans of Pearl Harbor, now seeking revenge, unleashed 519 rounds of 16-inch shells, 1,845 rounds of 14-inch shells, and 1,793 500-pound aerial bombs on Peleliu. The thunder was so intense that men on the transport ships had to shout at the top of their lungs to be heard. The spectacle was impressive, but its effectiveness was illusory. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commander of the bombardment force, was so confident in the destruction achieved that he terminated the bombardment a day early on September 14th, declaring he had run out of targets. Most of the supporting vessels then departed for the Philippines, leaving the Marines with less fire support than originally planned. What Oldendorf and his staff didn't realize was that the bombardment, while devastating to surface structures and vegetation, had barely scratched Nakagawa's underground fortress. The shells that hit the coral ridges simply shattered against the rock, unable to penetrate deep enough to reach the cave systems. The few direct hits on cave entrances were often absorbed by the steel doors or merely collapsed the outer chambers while leaving the defensive positions intact. Japanese casualties from the 3-day bombardment were minimal, perhaps a few hundred men at most. The vast majority of Nakagawa's force remained safely underground, waiting. Major General William H. Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, shared Oldendorf's optimism. A Marine since 1913, Rupertus had fought in Haiti, China, and earlier Pacific campaigns. He was a demanding leader, nicknamed Old Horsehead by his troops for his craggy features. On the eve of the invasion, Rupertus made a prediction that would haunt him. Peleliu would be secured in 3 or 4 days. Some accounts quote him as saying it would be a short operation, a hard-fought quickie that will last 4 days, 5 at the most. This prediction was based on several faulty assumptions: faith in the effectiveness of naval gunfire, underestimation of Japanese defensive capabilities, overconfidence in marine combat doctrine, and poor intelligence about the terrain. Perhaps most critically, Rupertus's prediction reflected the lessons of recent amphibious operations, where overwhelming American firepower had crushed Japanese resistance in relatively short order. But Peleliu would prove different, catastrophically different. D-Day, September 15, 1944. At 5:30 a.m. on September 15, 1944, the naval bombardment resumed with renewed fury. For 3 hours, American ships hammered the beaches and visible targets, attempting to soften up the defenses one final time. Carrier-based aircraft added to the din, strafing and bombing anything that might conceal enemy positions. Smoke from explosions and burning vegetation soon obscured much of the island. At 8:32 a.m., just 2 minutes behind schedule, the first wave of amphibious tractors, LVTs, crossed the line of departure and headed toward Peleliu's southwestern beaches. The assault plan called for 3 regiments of the 1st Marine Division to land abreast on a 2,200-yard stretch of beach. The operation was meticulously planned. 4,500 Marines were to reach shore in the first 19 minutes. On the northern end, Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller's 1st Marine Regiment would land on White Beach 1 and 2. Puller, at 46 years old, was already a legend in the Marine Corps. Born in Virginia and raised on stories of Confederate cavalry raids, he had joined the Marines in 1918 and spent the interwar years in Haiti and Nicaragua hunting guerrillas. His nickname came from his barrel chest, which he thrust out aggressively when standing. He had won 3 Navy Crosses at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, and his men would follow him anywhere. But Puller's assignment was the toughest of all. His regiment was to wheel left after landing and assault the Unbreakable southern approaches, including a coral promontory the Marines would name the Point. In the center, Colonel Harold D. Bucky Harris's 5th Marine Regiment would land on Orange Beach 1 and 2, driving straight inland to capture the airfield and cut the island in half. On the south flank, Colonel Herman Hard-Headed Hannikin's 7th Marine Regiment would land on Orange Beach 3, sweep the southern portion of the island, and protect the division's right flank. Only 1 battalion was held in divisional reserve, a decision that reflected Rupertus's optimism, but would prove dangerously optimistic.
As the first waves of LVTs churned through the water toward the beaches, many Marines sang or joked nervously. These were veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, the old breed, men who had already seen more combat than most soldiers experienced in an entire war. Some had eaten steak and eggs for breakfast, a tradition for men going into battle, possibly their last meal. Eugene Sledge, a young mortarman with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, would later write that he was shocked to be thrown into the Battle of Peleliu, where the world was a nightmare of flashes, explosions, and snapping bullets. The Japanese allowed the first waves to approach unmolested. Nakagawa's orders were clear: wait until the beaches were crowded with men and equipment, then open fire. At approximately 8:30 a.m., as additional waves of Marines landed and began moving inland, Japanese artillery observers gave the signal. Suddenly, the beaches erupted in chaos. Steel doors on cave positions swung open, revealing artillery pieces and anti-tank guns. The Japanese had pre-registered their weapons on every square yard of the beach, and their fire was devastating. 47mm anti-tank guns and 20mm cannons mounted in coral outcroppings raked the beaches with enfilading fire. Mortars rained down from the ridges. By 9:30 a.m., the Japanese had destroyed 26 LVTs and 60 DUKWs, amphibious trucks. Bodies floated in the blood-tinged water. The coral sand was stained red. The 1st Marines on White Beach immediately ran into murderous fire from the Point, a 30-foot-high coral ridge at the northern end of the landing area. Japanese gunners firing from concealed bunkers could hit the Marines from their exposed flank, creating a deadly crossfire. Puller's own LVT was hit by a dud high-velocity round. Had it exploded, the regimental commander would have been killed on D-Day. His communications section, following behind in another Amtrak, took a direct hit from a 47mm shell and was annihilated.
Marines scrambled over the beach, seeking any cover they could find: a coral outcropping, a disabled LVT, a shell crater. Some didn't make it. The average life expectancy for the first wave after exiting their LVTs was, by some estimates, less than 1 minute in the most heavily contested areas. Within the first hour, approximately 200 Marines were killed and another 900 wounded. Bodies were dragged to aid stations hastily established behind whatever cover could be found. Navy corpsmen, unarmed medics who accompanied Marine units, moved through the fire to reach the wounded, many becoming casualties themselves. Despite the carnage, the Marines pushed inland. This was their doctrine: land, establish a beachhead, and keep moving forward regardless of casualties. Staying pinned on the beach meant death. The 5th Marines in the center made the best progress, fighting through a gauntlet of Japanese fire to reach the edge of the airfield by mid-morning. The 7th Marines on the southern flank also advanced steadily, though they too took heavy casualties. But the 1st Marines on the left flank were stalled. The Point had to be taken before the regiment could advance. Colonel Puller ordered Captain George P. Hunt, commander of K Company, 3rd Battalion, to capture the position. What followed was one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the war. The fight for the Point. Captain Hunt was a Yale graduate, son of a Wall Street banker, who had joined the Marines out of a sense of duty after Pearl Harbor. His company of approximately 230 men was ordered to take the Point, a seemingly straightforward objective that would turn into a 30-hour nightmare. The Point was not a single position, but a complex of reinforced bunkers, pillboxes, and interconnected caves carved into a coral ridge. Japanese defenders, armed with machine guns, rifles, and grenades, had clear fields of fire over the beaches. Taking it would require courage, grenades, demolitions, and brutal close-quarters fighting.
Hunt's Marines attacked the point from multiple directions, using fire and maneuver tactics drilled into them through months of training. Marines would lay down suppressive fire, while others rushed forward with satchel charges, canvas bags filled with explosives, to blow bunker entrances. Flamethrowers, newly issued weapons that many Marines were using for the first time in combat, proved terrifyingly effective at clearing positions. The weapon shot a stream of jellied gasoline that could reach 40 yards, incinerating anyone inside a bunker or cave. The fighting was savage. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, refusing to surrender even when their positions became untenable. Many fought until killed. Marines cleared bunkers one by one, often having to climb over the bodies of the enemy to reach the next position. The coral rock, shattered by explosions, became deadly shrapnel that caused terrible wounds. By nightfall on September 15th, Captain Hunt's company had seized most of the point, but they were surrounded, low on ammunition, and running out of water. Japanese forces infiltrated around them during the night, attempting to recapture the position. Small groups of enemy soldiers attacked repeatedly. Marines fought in near-total darkness, identifying targets by sound and muzzle flashes. Wounded men continued to fight from their positions, knowing that if the point fell, the entire beachhead could be compromised. For 30 hours, K Company held out. They repelled 4 major counterattacks and countless smaller probes. At one point, they were so low on ammunition that Marines threw rocks at advancing Japanese soldiers. Relief finally came on the morning of September 17th, when elements of the 2nd Battalion fought through to reach them. Of the 230 Marines who attacked the point, only 18 remained unwounded. Captain Hunt and his executive officer, Lieutenant Henry W. Hahn, both received the Navy Cross for their leadership during the action. The fight for the point exemplified the nature of combat on Peleliu: brutal, close quarters, and extraordinarily costly. But it was merely the beginning. The advance into hell. By the end of D-Day, approximately 15,000 Marines had landed on Peleliu. They held a shallow beachhead extending perhaps 300 yards inland at its deepest point. Casualties were staggering: 210 Marines killed in action and another 900 wounded. 4 Navy hospital ships offshore were overwhelmed with wounded. The scene on the beaches was one of organized chaos, supplies piling up, wounded waiting for evacuation, disabled vehicles, and the ever-present threat of enemy artillery fire from the ridges. General Rupertus, despite the casualty figures, ordered his units to maintain offensive pressure. The battle plan called for aggressive action, and Rupertus believed that momentum was essential. On September 16th and 17th, the Marines pushed deeper into the island. The 5th Marines captured the airfield relatively quickly. The flat, open ground was the only terrain on Peleliu where American armored support could operate effectively. By September 17th, Navy Seabees had repaired the runway, and American aircraft began operating from the field. Stinson OY-1 observation planes conducted aerial spotting for artillery, and on September 26th, F-4U Corsair fighters from Marine Fighter Force 115 landed and began close air support missions. The 7th Marines in the south also made good progress, securing the southern end of the island and the neighboring small island of Negasibus by early October. But in the north, the 1st Marines' advance had ground to a halt against the Unbreakable. The Marines had encountered nothing like the Unbreakable in previous campaigns. Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester had been jungle fighting, where visibility was limited, but the terrain could be traversed. The Unbreakable was different, a hellish maze of razor-sharp coral ridges, vertical cliffs, narrow defiles, and hidden caves. The ridges were so steep that in some places ropes had to be used to climb them. The coral itself was treacherous, porous, and unstable, offering no secure footing. It was impossible to dig foxholes or even shallow scrapes in the rock, leaving Marines completely exposed to Japanese mortar fire. Every explosion in the coral created deadly secondary fragmentation. When a mortar shell hit the ridge, it not only sent out steel fragments, but also caused chunks of razor-sharp coral to spray in all directions. The injuries were horrific. Men torn apart by shrapnel, limbs severed, faces destroyed. Corpsmen struggled to stop bleeding from multiple wounds. The coral dust that covered everything got into wounds, causing infections that would not heal properly for months.
The heat was another enemy. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching saturation. Marines wore heavy dungarees, helmets, and carried weapons, ammunition, and equipment that could weigh 60 pounds or more. Heat exhaustion became epidemic. Men collapsed, unable to continue. The division's water supply was contaminated, distributed in empty oil drums that hadn't been properly cleaned. The water tasted of petroleum and caused nausea and diarrhea. Some Marines became so desperate they drank from shell craters or even attempted to extract moisture from vegetation. Adding to the misery was the stench. Bodies of dead Japanese soldiers, killed in the initial bombardment or subsequent fighting, lay decomposing in the tropical heat. American dead had to be recovered under fire, a dangerous and traumatic duty. Human waste accumulated because it was impossible to dig proper latrines in the coral. The smell was overwhelming, a nauseating mixture of death, cordite, fuel, and human waste. Eugene Sledge later wrote, "Fear and filth went hand in hand. It has always puzzled me that this important factor in our daily lives has received so little attention from historians." The Japanese defenders exploited every advantage the terrain offered. Snipers concealed themselves in caves high on the ridges, firing down on Marines attempting to advance below. Japanese soldiers would emerge from hidden tunnel entrances, attack, and disappear before the Marines could respond. Artillery observers, safe in deep caves, called down mortar fire with devastating accuracy. The defenders had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water in their underground positions and could hold out for weeks. Colonel Puller's 1st Marines, assigned to reduce the Unbreakable, were being bled white. The regiment launched attack after attack up the ridges, which the Marines had nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. Each assault followed the same pattern. Marines would advance under covering fire, climb the ridges under intense enemy fire, seize a position at terrible cost, then be forced to withdraw when Japanese fire from adjacent positions made the captured ground untenable. Gains measured in yards cost lives measured in dozens. The relief of the 1st Marines. By September 21st, the 1st Marine Regiment was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Of the 3,251 men who had landed on D-Day, 1,749 had become casualties, a 54% casualty rate. Some rifle companies were down to 20 or 30 effectives. Officers and NCOs who led from the front had been killed or wounded at even higher rates. The regiment could no longer function as a cohesive unit. Major General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps and overall commander of Operation Stalemate II, had been observing the situation closely. Geiger was a pioneer Marine aviator, one of the first to earn his wings, and he had commanded Marine Air Forces at Guadalcanal. He was also a realist who understood when plans had to change. Despite General Rupertus's protests, Rupertus wanted only Marines to secure Peleliu and had resisted calling for army reinforcements. Geiger intervened. On September 21st, Geiger visited Colonel Puller's command post. He found Puller shirtless, limping from an old wound and new exhaustion, with a corncob pipe clenched in his teeth. The normally aggressive Puller could barely articulate the situation his regiment faced. When Geiger asked if he needed reinforcements, Puller replied that he was doing all right with what he had, but it was clear to everyone present that this was not true.
Puller was physically and emotionally spent, devastated by the losses his regiment had suffered. Geiger made the decision Rupertus would not. He ordered the 1st Marines pulled out of the line and replaced by fresh troops from the Army's 81st Infantry Division, which had already secured the nearby island of Angar. On September 23rd, the battered survivors of the 1st Marines were relieved. As they stumbled back to the rest area, many men wept, not from relief, but from grief at leaving their dead comrades behind, and from the psychological trauma of what they had endured. At a memorial service for the fallen on September 29th, Puller looked, in the words of one observer, like hell. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark. Years later, Puller would call Peleliu his toughest operation of the war. In letters written at the time, he expressed deep sorrow for the casualties. May God rest the souls of our dead and make life less bitter for our maimed and crippled. The relief of the 1st Marines marked a turning point in the battle. The Army's 321st Infantry Regiment, followed by the 323rd, took over operations against the Unbreakable. These soldiers, many of them combat veterans themselves, brought fresh energy, but also had to learn the terrible lessons of fighting in the Coral Ridges. The 5th and 7th Marines also rotated into the fight, attacking the Unbreakable from different angles. The Siege of the Pocket. By late September, American forces had secured most of Peleliu, including the airfield and the southern portion of the island. Only the Unbreakable remained in Japanese hands, but this area, soon known as the Pocket, held approximately 1,500 Japanese defenders and would take 2 more months to subdue. The fighting in the Pocket was unlike anything American forces had yet experienced in the Pacific War. It was not traditional combat, but siege warfare, reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I. American forces could not simply attack and overwhelm the Japanese positions. Every cave had to be located, then reduced through a painstaking process that combined artillery, naval gunfire, airstrikes, demolitions, and infantry assault. New tactics evolved. Tanks mounting flamethrowers would maneuver close to cave entrances and shoot streams of burning napalm inside, incinerating defenders or forcing them deeper into the cave system. Engineers used satchel charges and TNT to seal cave entrances, entombing the defenders. In some cases, hundreds of pounds of explosives were lowered into cave shafts to collapse entire sections of the cave network.